DNA is the language of life. It is genetic information which is stored and retrieved with algorithmic processes so that it conforms with linguistics laws, which go beyond Zipf's law, and possesses the human language properties of phonetics, punctuation, syntax, and grammar. It is said that the average man is approximately 6 feet tall. If unraveled, the DNA molecule from any cell in his body would be approximately 7 feet long. The molecule is called deoxyribonucleic acid. One of the information packaging processes of the cell is to collect information from the DNA molecule to do work. This produces an RNA molecule called ribonucleic acid. The process is called transcription. DNA polymerase is one of the critically important molecular machines of the cell. It replicates genetic information from the DNA strand. It performs at least 3 DNA information proofreading functions, and it repairs the effects of random genetic mutation by chewing back over mismatches and restoring the reassembly of the molecule. Genetic information is stored and retrieved using algorithmic processes. It is also repaired using them. In a recent study by Professors Vane Basic, Sashi Chilpagri, David Gilbraith, and Michael Marcellin, they state, "In this project we study an information theoretical framework for DNA repair, which views it as an error correction system. We are applying the principles and methods of information theory and coding theory to incorporate phenomenon observed on different levels of abstraction of the genomic error correction system." They state further, "The model encompasses the multi-level structure of genetic error correction system and interactions not only among its different levels, but also among other subsystems in the cell. In order to understand such a complex system, specialized repair mechanisms, which have been the primary object of research in the past, must be considered in the context of the global error correction machinery. The proposed framework for rigorous treatment of DNA repair enables describing its functionality quantitatively and algorithmically." Genetic information and retrieval processes operate on algorithms. What you see on the screen is a relatively simple computer algorithm used for Microsoft Windows. It is a mathematical equation designed to compare information and decide what work must be done based upon the comparison of that information. These are the processes performed by microscopic molecular protein machines in the cell.
But when we look at the DNA, for example, in our cells, in the smallest, simplest cell we know anything about, there is so much complex information there that it's mind-boggling. It supersedes anything man is doing today.
Information is like many, many sets of encyclopedias, and it's basically an instruction manual on how to build a human cell and how to build a human body. Or actually, more accurately, it's less like a book than a computer program. It's like an operating system, but it's vastly superior to any operating system man has developed.
Yeah, there's nothing that we've come up with yet that can come close, right?
Nothing can come close. In fact, as every year we realize that it's more and more marvelous than we thought.
The digitally encoded genetic information of the DNA molecule is equal to many, many books worth of information, far more than what you see in this illustration. It is the recipe for the design and function of an organism. All of the structural features of an organism are defined by genetic information, plus information found in the structural design of the cell. It is the information of the genome of a spider, for example, that produces a spider. It is the information in the genome of a mouse which produces the structural design of a mouse, and much of its biochemistry. Likewise, the same is true of a cat and all other kinds of life. The process of gene expression is the unimaginably complex turning on and off of genes in various orders and patterns to develop an organism during its embryonic stage of development. It may be considered as the instruments in an orchestra being turned on and off in various patterns, those vastly far and away more complex. It is so complex, in fact, that we will probably not understand very much of it, no matter how long we study it. Genetic information possesses linguistics properties. Linguistics is the study of human speech, including the units, nature, structure, and modification of language. The two key words here are speech and language. This information storage and retrieval system operates with algorithms which go beyond Zipf's law of linguistics and complexity. What you see on the screen now is an illustration of Zipf's law of linguistics in mathematical expression. Genetic information also possesses the property of grammar. Grammar is a system of rules that define the grammatical structure of a language. Classes of words, their inflections, and their function or relations in the sentence is grammar. Syntax is also a property of genetic information. Syntax is the way in which linguistic elements, such as words, are put together to form constituents, such as phrases or clauses. For example, if we had the following words: fox lazy, the, over, dog quick, the, brown jumped, they would not make any sense to us in this order. But if we rearrange their order, we get the following sentence: the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. Then the sentence would make sense to us. Punctuation is another property of genetic information. Punctuation is the act or practice of inserting standardized marks or signs in written matter to clarify the meaning and separate structural units, also a system of punctuation. For example, with the sentence, the brown fox being quick jumped over the lazy dog. The first sentence tells us that being quick is what the dog was doing. That being quick was an action by the dog. However, with the punctuation in place, the sentence's meaning changes considerably. Instead of being an action, quick is now a characteristic of the dog. Instead of the dog being quick in action, now being quick is a property of the dog. The brown fox, being quick, jumped over the lazy dog. Instead of the brown fox being quick, jumped over the lazy dog. This is how genetic information can be modified significantly by the punctuation found therein. An important aspect of information is that it is not bound to its medium. For example, the Bible can be printed as a paged book. It can also be burned to a compact disc. It can also be written up as HTML web pages to be viewed on a computer. In all three examples, the information has not changed one bit. The only thing that has changed is the medium. The information is the same. Here we have three mediums conveying exactly the same information. This is because the information itself is not the web page, it is not the compact disc, nor is it the book. It is the words. And the medium may change, but the information will not. Information is not bound to its medium. It is massless, intangible, immaterial, and an abstract construct of mind. The only place information comes from is mind. It cannot arise from any place else. The material world has no potential to create information.
There are many examples in creation of things that demonstrate the biblical God. One would be in our very DNA. Our DNA has information in it. And there is a whole field of scientific study called information science, which studies how information originates, how it's transmitted, and so on. And one of the laws of information science says that information never originates by itself in matter, never spontaneously comes about. Anytime we trace the copying of information back to its source, it always comes back to a mind. And since we have creative information in DNA, that tells me that DNA comes from intelligence. It's not something that could possibly come about through millions of years.
And that's how the information we pass on from generation to generation. So not only does DNA enable the information to be passed on, but it's information that codes for something. In fact, the information in each of our cells is the equivalent of about 100,000 books of information. These are large volumes of information. That's a lot of information. So it's very lucky that our cells aren't using paper and ink to store the information. Now, to explain a bit about information, it's nothing to do with the material it's on, because, see, I've got information in a book, and here the information is in the form of paper and ink. But the information is not the paper and ink, it's the way the paper and ink is arranged. If I read the book to you, the information would be the same, but it's in the form of patterns of sound waves. When I wrote it on my computer, the information was in a pattern of on-off pattern, magnetic patterns on a metallic disc. If it's sent by email, then the information is a form of electrical impulses. So same information, different ways of transmitting it. And in the DNA, the information is stored in the form of chemical letters. Now, it is possible to write out the information of your DNA in paper and ink form. That's what the Human Genome Project was all about.
Information is the communication or reception of knowledge or intelligence, or knowledge obtained from investigation, study, or instruction. One stumbling block for materialism and evolutionism is that matter has no consciousness. It is not a thinking entity, and therefore cannot produce information. The communication or reception of knowledge or intelligence cannot come from matter alone. Matter has no knowledge. It has no mind. Nor does it have intelligence. Nor does it study, investigate, or instruct without the presence of mind. Any genetic process in the cell designed to investigate, study, or provide instructions was devised by a mind. One expert on this subject, Dr. Werner Gitt, Director and Professor of the German Federal Institute of Physics and Technology, Head of the Department of Information Technology, states, "There is no known natural law through which matter can give rise to information, neither is there any physical process or material phenomenon known that can do this. Material quantities cannot produce information."
Now let me come to the laws of nature about information. There are 10 laws of nature about information. The first one is, anything material, such as physical chemical processes, cannot create something non-material. A very important law of nature about information. Let me come to the second one. Information is a non-material fundamental entity and not a property of matter. In many books nowadays you find the idea that information is a part of matter. That is a wrong idea. The third one is, information requires a material medium for storage and transmission. The fourth one, information cannot originate in statistical processes. Number 5, there can be no information without a code. We have seen it in the examples I showed to you. In all cases there was a code system. Number 6, all codes result from an intentional choice and agreement between sender and recipient. Number 7, the determination of meaning for and from a set of symbols is a mental process that requires intelligence. That's what we see in all cases, in all known systems. Number 8, there can be no new information with an intelligent, purposeful sender. That's what we observe in all systems which are known. There is a sender and also one or more recipients. And we see all the 5 levels are important on both sides, on the sender side and also on the recipient side. For example, on the level of semantics, you see the communicated ideas on the sender side, and on the recipient side is the question, is this meaning understood? Number 9, any given chain of information can be traced back to an intelligent source. Let me give an example to understand it a little bit better. If you drive with a car and you listen to your radio, is the radio the source of information? No, not the radio. Is the antenna the source of information? No. If you trace back, you come to a sender, to an author who gave the information. And that's what we see in all cases. In most cases, we cannot see the sender. For example, if you go to a library and you see thousands of books in the library, very seldom you will see the sender, the author of the books. Nevertheless, it is information. Number 10, information comprises the non-material foundation for all technological systems, works of art, biological systems. Let me come to the first conclusion. Since the DNA code of all life forms is clearly within the definition domain of information, we conclude there must be a sender. It is a very important conclusion. If somebody would say life is coming without a sender, we can say from a viewpoint of law of nature, it is a wrong idea. Total wrong. What is the conclusion we can make here? We can say atheism is a wrong idea. We can say it by using a law of nature. And law of nature has the highest level of science. We can say if we have a look to the living systems, we find all the levels of information. Now we will get more information about the sender. What can we say about the sender from the viewpoint of laws of nature about information? The first conclusion we have found, there must be a sender. But we can say more about the sender. Since the density and complexity of the DNA encoded information is billions of times greater than man's present technology, we conclude the sender must be supremely intelligent. I had a lecture on a university in Germany, and I was speaking about the DNA molecule, about the density of information and so on, and also I was using the term sender, the sender of the information. And then a student asked me, I understand what you want to say. You will say there is a God necessary. Oh, I say, it's a very good conclusion. Very good conclusion, you have understand what I want to say. But she said now, but my question is another one. Can you tell me who gave the information to God? Oh, very good question. No, I said to her, no problem. There is an overgod, and the overgod has more information than God has. God needs only so much information to construct and to program the DNA molecule. And the overgod has more information and gave him the information to do this. But the next question is, who gave the information to the overgod? No, there must be an overgod. And the overgod gave the information to the overgod. And so it is okay. Yeah, but there's another question. Who gave the information to the overgod? Oh, there must be an overgod. And you see what happened? How many gods do we need? An infinite number of gods. And each god has a little bit more information than the god before. That's what this conclusion can be made from the information we find in the living systems. What can we say about the last one in this long sequence? If we are speaking about the infinite number, we cannot say speak in the term the last one, but I will do it now for understanding it better. The last one in this sequence must have all information about everything. He must know all the snowflakes on the Himalaya, all the sands on all beaches around the world. He must know what all cells in our body are doing at this moment. He must know everything about each atom in the sun, what is the pressure, what is the temperature, everything. And he must know everything about our life, everything. He has the total knowledge. But it is easier in the same way to say not an infinite number of gods. It is from the viewpoint of logic the same statement if we say there is only one God. But what is the conclusion for this one God? He must have all information. Infinite. He must have infinite information. So we can make the second conclusion about the sender. The sender is omniscient. He is infinite in intelligence and information. We can make another conclusion which is very important. Because he knows everything, we can say he knows everything at the moment. But he also must know everything in the past. But what about the future? He must know everything in future. If he would know, he didn't know everything in future, so he has not an infinite information. But we have made the conclusion he must have an infinite number of information and intelligence. Therefore, he must know everything in the past and in the future. What is the conclusion? This sender, this God, must be eternal. You see, we can make this conclusion from the laws of nature about information. The sender is omnipotent, we can also say, in the same way as I have made the conclusion in the way of information. Since the sender must have encoded the information into the DNA molecules, constructed the molecule biomachines required for the encoding, decoding and synthesizing processes, and designed all the features for the original life forms, we conclude the sender must be purposeful and supremely powerful. Where did the sender's information and creative power originate? There are two possibilities: a regression of senders extending back to a sender possessing infinite information, intelligence and power, or one eternal sender with infinite information, intelligence and power. So we know a little bit more about the sender. Number 3, the sender must be omnipotent, and the sender, number 4, must be eternal. Let me come to another conclusion, number 4. Since information is a non-material fundamental entity and cannot originate from material quantities, we conclude the sender must have a non-material component. The sender must be spirit. God is spirit. Now let's see our conclusions about the sender from the point of view of laws of nature about information. We see on the left side the 5 points we find out. There must be a sender. The sender must be omniscient, infinite in intelligence and information. The sender must be omnipotent, almighty. The sender must be eternal, and the sender must have at least a non-material component. Now, after finding to the conclusions by using laws of nature, we can have a look at the Bible and to see if our conclusions are right. And you see, to the 5 conclusions, you see here a few verses of the Bible which says the same. The fool says in the heart, there is no God. Now we can see that you know all things. That is for number 2. And number 3, I am the Alpha and the Omega, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. Number 4, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. And number 5, we find it in John chapter 4, verse 24, God is Spirit. Now the next question is, who is the sender? Who is the creator? And we see we come now to a scientific boundary. We cannot say from the viewpoints of laws of nature about information who the person of the sender is. Now we need another source of information. And this other source of information is the Bible. And the Bible tells us in Genesis 1, 10 times was it, and God said. And in Psalm 33 we read, for he spoke, and it came to be, he commanded, and it stood firm. The sender, God, can do it in a very short time. And more about the person of sender we find in the New Testament. In the beginning of the Gospel of John we read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. If you read further in chapter 1 of Gospel John, we see this person is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the Creator. It's not possible to come to these conclusions using the laws of nature. Therefore we need the Bible. We need both the laws of nature about information and also the Bible. The Bible is a higher level of information. Let me come to the 5th conclusion. Since information is a non-material fundamental entity and cannot originate from material quantities, and since information also originates from man, we conclude man's nature must have a non-material component. The materialism is saying man is only matter. We can see the laws of nature about information says it is a wrong idea. Can we give an answer about the Big Bang? Of course, we can use also the laws of nature. Since information is non-material entity, we conclude that the assumption the universe is composed solely of mass and energy is false. That is the idea of the Big Bang. In the beginning there was only matter and energy. Energy and matter are material entities. And one law of nature says the matter cannot create a non-material entity. In our world we find many books with information. We find in our cells there is a lot of information. So we see in this moment there is a lot of information in many places in this world. So the information cannot come from matter and energy. So we can say this idea is wrong. I will say it is the shortest way to say the Big Bang is a wrong idea. We don't need all the aspects from astronomy or whatever. We can do it also, but in this way we can refute it in a very short way. Let me come to the seventh conclusion. Since biological information originates only from an intelligent sender, and all theories of chemical and biological evolution require that information must originate solely from mass and energy alone, it means no sender, we conclude all theories or concepts of chemical and biological evolution are false. All ideas. And if you will see tomorrow or a year later a new idea about evolution, we can say also this idea will be false. Evolution is an impossible process. We can say it from the highest level of science, from the viewpoint of laws of nature. Anyone who disagrees with these laws and conclusions must falsify them by demonstrating the initial origin of information from purely material sources. That is what must be done if somebody would say, I disagree with the conclusions. Therefore, the laws of nature about information have refuted the assumption of scientific materialism and theories of chemical and biological evolution, and established the existence of an eternal, omniscient, omnipotent being. All philosophies or theories based on the assumption of scientific materialism, including chemical and biological evolution, are falsified by the laws of nature about information. So we see the conclusions, the 7 conclusions, are very, very strong. They give us the possibility to show which ideas are wrong, which are published in science.
If an author imagines a book, the information comes first from their mind. It will then be printed as a physical book so that it can be conveyed to the reader. The book is the medium that conveys the information. It is not the information itself. The same is true of genetic information. The information that defines the structural design of the various life forms in the world was first conceived by a mind, and the medium which conveys that genetic information, the genome of that organism, was manufactured afterward as a medium to convey that genetic information. This is one way in which we know that all life in the world was intelligently designed and specially created, because the information arose first in the mind of its author, and then the medium which conveys it was created to convey that information. It can be no other way. Science has provided empirical evidence of both intelligent design and special creation that is unarguable. It is no longer tenable to argue that evolutionary process is the origin of the genome of any living creature, merely for the fact that genetic information cannot be produced by nature, and because information is conveyed by a medium to which it is not bound. This is verification of intelligent design and special creation for all living things.
One of the things I do in my classes to get this idea across to students is I hold up 2 computer disks. One is loaded with software, the other one is blank. And I ask, what's the difference in mass between these 2 computer disks as a result of the difference in the information content that they possess? And of course the answer is 0, none. There is no difference as a result of the information. And that's because information is a massless quantity. Now, if information is not a material entity, then how can any materialistic explanation explain its origin? How can any material cause explain its origin? And this is the real fundamental problem that the presence of information in biology has posed. It creates a fundamental challenge to the materialistic evolutionary scenarios, because information is a different kind of entity that matter and energy cannot produce. In the 19th century, we thought that there were two fundamental entities in science, matter and energy. At the beginning of the 21st century, we now recognize that there's a third fundamental entity, and it's information. It's not reducible to matter, it's not reducible to energy, but it's still a very important thing that is real. We buy it, we sell it, we send it down wires. Now, what do we make of the fact that information is present at the very root of all biological function? That in biology we have matter, we have energy, but we also have this third very important entity, information. The biology of the information age, I think, poses a fundamental challenge to any materialistic approach to the origin of life.
And it is impacting their worldview? Or are they saying, no, it's affirming our worldview?
I don't think anyone's saying it affirms their worldview, because it's becoming extremely problematic to explain how the genome could arise and how these multiple levels of overlapping information could arise. Since our best computer programs can't even conceive of overlapping codes, what we're seeing is, and our best, the genome dwarfs all of the computer information technology that man has developed. So I think that, yes, it's very problematic to imagine how you could achieve that through random changes in the code. No one, even computer viruses are designed, and so there's not within all the programs of your computer, there's not a single 0 or 1 that's there by chance, and there's no junk DNA in these codes. Well, more and more the genome looks like a super set of programs, and it's very hard to imagine how that came together.
Another remarkable property of genetic information is its interdependence. Consider a bicycle. The parts of the bicycle are worthless to us without the list of parts. Likewise, the list of parts for the bicycle is worthless to us without the parts. We need both the list of parts and instructions for assembly, and the parts themselves, for the bicycle to be worth anything to us. Genetic information is the same way. It is also interdependent. Approximately 3%, per current knowledge, of the human genome is information which codes for proteins. The rest of the molecule is other information, and some of it is meta-information. Meta-information is information about other information. The remainder of the genome is also meta-information. It is information which defines an organism during its embryonic development. It is also information which determines how the coding genes which produce proteins are utilized. 73 to 94% of the human DNA molecule is decoded by the cell, per current knowledge. This is contrary to what the evolution defenders have been saying for decades. They have been saying that the majority of the DNA molecule was garbled junk left over from man's history of evolution. The processes of random mutation, which were mistakes, as all mutations are, left over, and provides no function. Today we know this to be completely false. It is vital information. The information which codes for proteins is dependent upon instruction sets elsewhere in the DNA, which govern its function. And the information which is meta-information is dependent upon the existence of the coding genes which produce proteins for the utilization of that information as well. This is interdependence, which cannot be broken. It is absurd to believe that random mutation could create two separate instruction sets in different locations of the genome, which would be required for each of them to have any value, and for this process to repeat itself countless times. But this is what an evolution defender must believe, to believe that random mutation is a mechanism for evolutionary change, or that genetic mutation, that random molecular interactions is what produce the human genome, or the genome of any living thing. It is completely absurd to believe such a thing. Modern science has discredited evolutionism.
Over 90% of the genome is actively transcribed, and that doesn't, there's probably more, but we have to study more carefully to find the function of the remaining part of the genome. And more than that, the genome has multiple overlapping messages. Try to imagine a book in a chapter, and the embedded in that chapter in addition to the obvious meaning of the words in the chapter, are other messages. And even in the same sentences, there might be several messages embedded. And even more astounding is, the DNA has two strands, one running one way and one running the other. For the longest time, they thought the one strand was just for replication and all the information was on the other strand. Just one strand had information. What they found with the ENCODE project was more than 50% of the genome, both strands are read. So it's like reading a sentence forward, so it has one meaning, and reading it backwards, and there's another message there. So it's data compression on the most sophisticated level.
Wow. And as you suggest in your book, there may be other aspects to data compression that have yet to be discovered, like almost several dimensions, or 3 or 4 dimensional, or whatever the case may be.
It is multidimensional, and one of the things that DNA does, it's like a tape with letters on it, and you can read it in a linear way, but it also folds up like origami, and you can make huge architectural structures that fill the genome, and we're just starting to understand that all that folding is like the folding of a protein.
This interdependence of information represents interdependence and irreducible complexity. Some of the molecular machines of the cell required for the functions of DNA and the cell are helicase, primase, topoisomerase, polymerase, ribosomes, and transfer molecules. These molecular machines are all interdependent with the cell and with genetic information. For example, they require the DNA to exist because the information which produces them is strings of information in the DNA molecule. Likewise, because the DNA molecule cannot maintain and duplicate itself without the existence of these molecular machines, it is also interdependent with them. This is interdependence and irreducible complexity that cannot be broken. Furthermore, DNA is interdependent with RNA because the information of DNA is transcribed to produce the RNA molecule. The RNA molecule's information is then used to create the molecular machinery of the cell. Therefore, the RNA molecule is interdependent with the DNA molecule. Neither can exist without the other. This is interdependence and irreducible complexity, which cannot be broken. Likewise, the RNA molecule is interdependent with these molecular machines as well, because the information which comes from the DNA molecule to produce the RNA molecule is then used to produce the molecular machines which maintain and duplicate and error-correct the DNA molecule itself. This is further interdependence, irreducible complexity, which cannot be broken. Moreover, the entire cell and DNA are interdependent, because the DNA molecule cannot exist without the molecular machinery of the cell and its environment, nor can the cell exist without the genetic information which codes for the genetic machinery which maintains the cell and the DNA molecule. This is interdependence and irreducible complexity. All components of a cell are irreducible in complexity and cannot be broken, else the system will not function. The DNA is interdependent with RNA, which is interdependent with the molecular machines, which is interdependent with the cell, which is interdependent with DNA, and all of them are interdependent with each other. This is interdependence and irreducible complexity which cannot be broken. This verifies for us that evolution not only did not take place, but cannot have taken place. All of the components of a cell are necessary for each other, for its function. It cannot have evolved in part, by increment, over time. It must have all existed together, at once in the beginning, else none of it would have function or meaning. Therefore, evolutionism is not only false, but impossible.
And it turns out that the decoding system in the cell is made of lots of protein. It's mainly the ribosome. It's a very complicated set of machinery, the ribosome. There are about 50 or so components to a ribosome. But the main amazing thing is the instructions to build the ribosome are on the DNA. But you need the ribosome to decode the DNA. So that's a real chicken and egg problem, isn't it? Because you can't have, there's no point having a DNA unless you have the ribosome to decode it. But you can't get the ribosome unless you have the instructions for it in the DNA. And one of the world's greatest philosophers of science, Sir Karl Popper, recognized the big problem. And he said that the origin of life and genetic code is a disturbing riddle. The genetic code is without any biological function unless it's translated, unless it leads to the synthesis of proteins whose structure is laid down by the code, but the machinery by which the cell translates the code consists of at least 50 macromolecular components that are themselves coded in the DNA. So the code can't be translated except by using products of its translation. And he goes on to say, this constitutes a baffling circle, a really vicious circle, it seems, when you attempt to form a model or theory of the genetic code. Thus, we may be faced with the possibility that the origin of life, like the origin of physics, becomes an impenetrable barrier to science and a residue to all attempts to reduce biology to chemistry and physics. So he thinks the origin of life is a real, it's a block for the materialist. The materialists have this conundrum trying to explain the origin of life from non-living chemicals without God.
A fairly recent study in genetics has revealed that the interdependence and complexity of the components of the cell is stupefying, by orders of magnitude beyond what we knew it was just 10 or 15 years ago. For example, Tony Paulson, cell biologist, University of Toronto, states, "When we started out, the idea was that signaling pathways were fairly simple and linear. Now we appreciate that the signaling information in cells is organized through networks of information rather than simple discrete pathways. It is infinitely more complex." In fact, some researchers who were part of the Human Genome Project attempted to map just the interactions of one protein, the p53. There are an estimated 200,000 or more proteins in the cell of a human being. They drew diagrams and bubbles and maps attempting to map all of the interdependencies and interactions between the p53 protein, other proteins, and the DNA molecule. They got only so far before throwing their hands up and declaring it impossible, because it was seemingly infinite in complexity. This was only one of the estimated 200,000 proteins in a human cell. In the days of Charles Darwin, it was believed that a cell was a membrane with some kind of complex goo inside it. Microscopes were very rudimentary. Today we know that a single cell from a human being, if expanded to the size of New York City, would be vastly more complex than New York City itself, with all of its birds, people, buildings, rooms, machinery, vehicles, street lights, telephone and electrical wiring, the trash on the streets, everything.
Nature by itself can't produce information. It can produce patterns. You know, if you're walking down the beach and you see ripples in the sand, what's your conclusion? Well, that nature, the waves, were coming up on shore and created this pattern. Nature can produce patterns, no problem. But if you're walking down the beach and you see John loves Mary and a heart with a arrow through it, you wouldn't conclude that the waves created that. Why? Because that's information with content. Nature doesn't do that. Nature produces patterns. It doesn't produce information with content. And whenever we see written information like that, whether it's in a book, whether it's in a newspaper, whether it's in a computer code, we know there is intelligence behind it. And when we look at DNA and we see these written instructions for the assembly of proteins in our bodies, I believe we are looking at some of the most powerful evidence that there must be an intelligence behind life.
If you go to a middle school biology class, they would present it as in a very simple way, where you have a group of organisms and 2 or 3 of them are mutant, they have some dysfunction, and 1 or 2 of them is extra good because it's had a beneficial mutation, so you just select away the bad individuals and let the best individual have extra children, and it's just all going to keep getting better. The reality is everybody's mutant, and basically all the differences, they're everybody carries tens of thousands of mutations, and the differences, each mutation has a minuscule effect, immeasurably small, so that the selection process has nothing to really grab hold of. It's kind of a trade secret amongst population geneticists, any really well-informed population geneticist understands that man is degenerating. And it's not an upward spiral of evolution, things keep getting better and better. It is a downward spiral, exactly as described in Scripture. And so it's my research, I thought, would I realized it had major implications for evolution, but I had I couldn't have guessed how profound the biblical implications are, how profoundly the evidence supports the biblical perspective of a dying universe and a dying world, and that we are dying because of the fall, and that we desperately, our only hope is Christ.